Hey everyone, this is Pete, and welcome back to Atari A to Z, a series of short playthroughs of Atari 8-bit games, some which I grew up with and some which are new to me. Today's game is Maniac Mover. This was a type-in listing from the August 1988 issue of Atari User, developed by Stephen Broomley. This was one of two games that Broomley had published by Atari User, and he was just 16 years old at the time. Elsewhere in this issue of Atari User, we had a type-in listing for developing your own cheats for games, a joystick super test, and an in-depth review and teardown of the much sought-after Atari XF551 disk drive. Topping the Gallup software charts for Atari 8-bit that month were Codemasters Grand Prix Simulator, followed closely by Silverbird's budget re-release of Activision's The Great American Cross Country Road Race, which might explain why Atari User decided to publish not one but two racing games as type-in listings for this issue. So let's go play one of them. Let's go play Maniac Mover.
Okay, here we are with Maniac Mover from Atari User, the August 1988 issue, as I say. So this was a type-in listing. I think it was a machine code listing, because the vast majority of the program listing was data statements, and then the sort of little bit of actual basic code at the beginning was mostly a call to a particular address in memory. And lots of pokes. And that was one approach of doing a machine code game, a type-in machine code game. The downside of doing it that way is that you had to spend a bit of time running the basic program for it to initialize and basically load all those data statements into memory before you can access them. And so the more popular approach was often something that Analog magazine in the States popularized, which is to have a basic routine at the beginning which will write a bootable cassette or disk from all the data statements, and then you can just boot from that disk or cassette and play the game without having to wait for initialization. You just have to wait for load times instead. So it was interesting to sort of compare and contrast the different approaches today. So Atari User's approach was to do the initialize every time approach, whereas Page 6's approach, which is was sort of our magazine of choice thanks to my dad and my brother writing for it, tended to use Analog's loader routine. But anyway, doesn't really matter for what we're doing today. We're just going to play Maniac Mover. So in Maniac Mover, you are driving an ambulance down a busy road and trying not to crash, and that's about it. Whoops. So it's basically the first level of Fire Chief, but without an end to it. It's not quite as refined and or fair as Fire Chief either, because, as you can see, the traffic randomly changes speed at various points, which makes it quite difficult to position yourself and not get slammed into. I guess you can sort of make the assumption that if you stay in a lane for a little while, it's going to change speed at some point, and so you should probably consider getting out of the way. You do have a convenient weapon in your arsenal though, which is if you put your siren on for a moment, you can pass through cars. You have to wait for that to recharge before you can use it again though. So while your ambulance is white, you can use the siren. But while it's blue, you can't. And so your sole aim in this game is just to get as far as you possibly can. And that tended to be the way that type-in listings worked, with a few exceptions. Most of them tended to be fairly simple, endless arcade-style affairs, because producing something that sort of had a definite ending and sort of discrete screens and so on was a lot of work. That's not to say that no one did it, but we actually tended to find that was a bit more common in the straight basic listings more than anything else. And I remember this specifically because there were a number of games that I typed in from Atari User and Page 6 where the actual level designs were recorded either in data statements or just in simple print statements to output the maps onto the screen using various redefined text characters. And I used to find it a ton of fun to... Oh, it changes colour if you get far enough. Yeah, I used to find it a ton of fun to actually fiddle around with those levels. And that was one of the cool things about type-in listings, is because they were written in a language that you could learn, in most cases, if they were written in BASIC anyway, you could fiddle around with them, you could tweak them, you could change them however you wanted, you could add cheats to them, you could change the scoring system, you could redesign the characters that were used, you could give yourself more lives, you could design new levels. That was something I always used to like, and that's something that I was always a bit sad about when it came to machine code games, because you couldn't change those. Because of the way that stuff was recorded in data statements, there was no easy way of looking at that and saying, okay, right, this bit obviously does this, and so on. There were people out there who could pass those data statements and know that if they changed a particular number at a particular point, that would have a specific effect. Because all machine code is sending a series of raw instructions to the computer to do particular things with bits of its hardware and operating system and so on. And there were people who knew how to program systems using purely that method. And what assembly language was, which is what most people associate with machine code, is a sort of slightly more human readable take on that raw machine code. And it's still complicated, and it's still all more about sort of addressing parts of the computer's memory and hardware directly, but it's a little bit more passable than looking at a string of hexadecimal numbers and knowing what they all do. Now, the thing with assembler, though, is that not everyone had a copy of the assembler editor cartridge. Whereas every single Atari computer had BASIC built into it, aside from the very earliest ones. But even then, they had a BASIC cartridge with them. So everyone with an Atari computer had access to some form of BASIC. Which meant that if there was a BASIC listing in a computer magazine, that they could type it in and then they could change it, they could mod it. It was a very early take on modding games. And quite a popular thing. You'd often find in subsequent issues of a magazine where a game had been published, you might find that later on there was another listing that you could either add to the previous one or replace certain lines in it to have a new experience of some sort. And I know a lot of my own very limited programming skills I learned from typing in these listings and then trying to change a few things about them and trying to recreate some of the things that I saw in them. But as I say, the unfortunate thing with machine code games is that although they ran faster and smoother and could do more and could sort of make more effective use of the Atari's hardware, they weren't as easy to fiddle around with. Now, in some cases, the authors of these games knew this, and so what they would do is they would subsequently put out things like level editors for their games. So a great example I can think of is one of the most fondly regarded games in Page 6 magazine was a sort of Boulder Dash clone called Munchie Madness. And that was popular enough that in a subsequent issue there was a level editor published for it where you can make your own screens and then you could save them to disk and you could share them with your friends on your disks and so on. And because it wasn't a commercial product, because it was something that you typed in and therefore effectively public domain, yeah, you could freely distribute that and share it with your friends, and so you could all have your own unique copy of Munchie Madness if you wanted to. So that was cool, but that did rely on the author actually making the effort to make some sort of user-friendly method of modding the game, which you couldn't always rely on, but you could sometimes. There were certain developers who were very good at that sort of thing. So the guy behind Munchie Madness, Paul Lay, he was very good at this sort of thing. He was very good at sort of explaining the things that he did in the programs that he wrote for these magazines, and providing new ways to enjoy them. Do you actually get more points if you're going faster? I can't really tell. So if we're going super slowly... Oh, you do. Okay. So I was just trying to work out if there was any value to actually trying to go faster, if you could just go really slowly for the entire time. And I guess if you do that, there's always the risk of something coming up behind you. And smashing straight into the back of you. Although it hasn't happened yet. Everything's coming from the front. Oops. That's what I get for staring at my score and not looking at where I'm going. But yeah, so if we accelerate, yes, it does go faster. Okay, so that answers my main question with this game: does the scoring system make sense? Yes, it does. The faster you go, the further you go, the more points you score. Yeah, obviously this is a really simple game, very arcade style, the sort of thing you'd get on a mobile phone these days, if anything. Although without any ads and microtransactions. Which is nice. But yeah, as a type-in listing, this was solid. I mean, it's well presented, it scrolls nicely, although the scrolling is sort of simulated by things moving on the screen rather than actual scrolling, I think. It's colourful, lots of different colours on the screen, a nice selection of different sprites for variety. I like the fact we've got tanks on the road as well as motorbikes and cars and stuff. Decent amount of detail and simplistic but solid gameplay. One thing I do always find quite funny, looking back at this era of games, is how the word men and the word lives was interchangeable for a while. So like in this game, you're not controlling a man, you're controlling an ambulance. There could be anyone in there. But no, you have men. This stems from the common description of, or common instructions for computer games, which told you that you need to move the little man around the screen. And while that sounds like something your grandma might say, you can actually find that exact phrasing in the official instruction books for some games. Like, I think a good example is if you look at the Atari 2600 version of Night Stalker, which we've previously covered on the Atari A to Z flashback series. It's not called Night Stalker on 2600, is it? It's one of those Intellivision games that got a name change. But yeah, the actual instructions for that game tell you to move the little man around the screen. Like, the little man doesn't have a name, he's just the little man. And that always makes me laugh looking back on that. But like, in situations like this, where the word men is just completely inappropriate for so many reasons, it's just amusing. And it wasn't just in like little small scale games like this as well. If you look at Namco's Rolling Thunder, it's sort of a classic arcade game. You'll see at the top of the screen, instead of lives, it says Man 3. In that game, it does sort of make sense because you are controlling a man in Rolling Thunder, but it's just funny. I don't know. I just find it amusing. Warp speed. This is a really difficult game. But it's got everything you need for a fun little arcade style experience. I mean, it's probably not going to keep you busy for hours at a time. Although I've sat here finding myself quite surprisingly enthralled by it for the last 15 minutes. So, you know, your mileage may vary and all that. Oops! Yeah, like I say, it's just a very simple, effective arcade-style game that's just about getting as high a score as possible, figuring out what limited mechanics there are, and taking a few chances. There's a bit of luck in this game, but it's not completely luck. Like, it might seem unfair when the cars change speed and plough straight into you, but you can mitigate that problem. You can mitigate that problem by positioning yourself in such a way where you've got time to respond, where there's not other vehicles getting in your way when you're doing that. You can speed up, you can slow down, you can move up and down, you can do all those things. And yeah, that means that it is possible to become skilled at this game. I am struggling to achieve that. I'm particularly struggling to recreate my 5,384 point high score, but even so, it is clearly possible to get good at Maniac Mover. Whoops. 3,500. That's going quite well. I've only got 1 men left though. I guess the men thing sort of ties in why some older gamers call extra lives 1-mans as well. Like if you've ever watched Game Grumps and heard Aaron refer to a 1-up in Super Mario Brothers as a 1-man, I imagine that probably stems from the same source. And the people who say that are probably the same sort of people who call levels boards or rounds. Because that sort of terminology was much more widespread in the sort of early to mid 80s, before level kind of got settled on. But in a way, using a different word kind of makes a bit more sense when you think about it, because level also became associated with role-playing games and the idea of character power level. Now granted, in a lot of cases, the use of level to indicate character power level and the use of level to indicate what stage of the game you're on tends not to be found in the same sort of game, but there are examples. And so in that situation, it makes a certain amount of sense for different words to be used for those things. So like you could have a level 5 character on round 3 of the game. Whereas if we have a level 5 character on level 5 of the game, there's ambiguity there. But yeah, over time we've just sort of settled on established... I guess that's why we use the word stage. The word stage is pretty widespread these days. And I guess if you have that situation that I just described there, you'd use the word level for the character and stage for your progress through the game. That makes sense. I should think before I speak. But I'm too busy... Oops. Too busy concentrating on Maniac Mover. Yeah, as I mentioned in the intro, this was actually one of 2 type-in listings that Atari User published that month that were on a racing theme. I don't know if that was a deliberate decision based on the Gallup chart at the time, but it's possible. I don't know how early in the editorial cycle they would have received that information from Gallup, but yeah, it's possible. It seems plausible as a decision that someone in charge of a magazine might make, particularly because on the cover of that issue it sort of promises 2 great racing games or whatever. So the other game in that issue was a game called Car Crazy, which was a sort of a top-down racer in the Super Sprint style. I haven't played that one, I don't think. I have played this one before. Because I'm pretty sure I typed this one in back in the day, but... yeah, Car Crazy I don't think I typed in. So we'll have to have a look into that at some point. I do like covering the type-in listings on this series as well, because as I've mentioned before, they're an important part of history of the Atari platform, and also of platforms like the Commodore 64 and the Spectrum as well. Obviously we're not looking at those on this series, but typing in listings was a vital part of computing culture at the time, because it's how a lot of people learned programming. It's how a lot of people got hold of some of their software, and it was just an activity you would do with your computer. Say, when you sat down for some time on your computer, because at the time sitting at your computer all day was not really something you did like it is today. But back in the day, when you sat down for some computer time, you would want sort of a variety of different activities to do. So that might be playing games, but it might also be writing your own programs, or using a word processor, or drawing some artwork, or typing in listings from magazines. And I remember, as much as I enjoyed playing games on the Atari 8-bit, there were also times when I'd just sit down and with the full intention of typing in something from a magazine. Like I'd read through our collection of Atari Users and Page 6s and Antics and find something that sort of took my fancy and thought, alright, I'm going to type that in today. And it was good for me in the long term, because it helped me to understand programming a bit better. And more significantly, for like my current life, it gave me a really good ability to type things in. Not just copying things from magazines, but also just typing in general. Like I've got a very, very high words per minute count, and I attribute that mostly to typing in stuff from magazines, which is nice. Anyway, I've probably rambled on for long enough. You get the idea of Maniac Mover by now. Let's leave that there for now, with my high score of 8,083 points. Not at all bad. Not at all bad. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.